The Solar Podcast is brought to you by Continental Energy Solutions. I'm Tim Montague, your host. Today on the Solar Podcast, I have a very special guest. He is the author of a wonderful book called How Solar Energy Became Cheap. He is also a lead author of the Sixth Assessment Report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. He is a professor of public affairs at UW-Madison. Welcome to the show, Gregory Nemet.
Hi, Tim. It's good to be here. Thank you.
So excited to dive into some of your work on the history of solar PV and hopefully touch on, the conclusions of that book, which are really focused on low carbon technologies and how can we leverage our experience as a species with photovoltaics and grow other low carbon technologies in perhaps a more effective and efficient manner than we did with solar PV. As many of my listeners know, the modern PV cell was invented in 1954 in New Jersey at Bell Labs. And here we are 70 years later, and solar is just taking off. And everybody in the world, wants and needs electricity. Some other technologies that we will talk about, like carbon capture or direct air capture, as it's commonly called now, are not quite the necessity of electricity. So I'm curious how humanity is going to address this and uptake these technologies. But the question stands: will humanity rise to the occasion, right, of climate change, which is now an existential threat? Before we get into all of this, though, Professor Nemet, give our listeners a little background on how did you get so interested in energy?
Yeah, good question. So, I did an undergraduate degree in geography. I took one class in energy systems and geography and another class on meteorology that included a part on climate change. And so those ideas kind of were seeded with me early on. And then I worked in the private sector for 7 years. I was doing management consulting. I was working in the pharmaceutical industry and was working in a startup in Silicon Valley, and then worked at a think tank on Sand Hill Road. And in the process of that work, I did one project, which was on the future of research and development. And we were looking at comparing innovation, looking at metrics of research dollars, of patents, of number of scientists and engineers hired in consumer products, information technology, healthcare. And we threw in energy as a comparison. And I was just astounded by, on every metric, energy was low by like an order of magnitude. R&D spending, patenting, all those things. And so I kind of got really interested in, I was surrounded by all this innovation and talent and money going into startups, and yet so little of it was going into what seemed like a really important problem. And so that's what I went to grad school on, is to address this question of how can we stimulate innovation in energy technology? And I still work on that now, and that's really what my book was about too. So it's really coming around to seeing it. And there's been so much more progress since then, which was like 20 years ago now. And that's really encouraging to see.
Yeah, I grew up in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and my dad was a techie and a DIYer, and we were doing solar thermal in our backyard. PV was barely on the scene, right, because it was only on satellites and remote telecommunications applications, because it was still a very relatively high cost technology. Here we are 50 years later, and it's everywhere, and it's on fire. It's a major force now in the global economy, and a major creator of economic opportunity, jobs, and more importantly now, cleaning the grid and ultimately fueling the energy transition. It is a force to reckon with. So it's wonderful. It's just a wonderful time to be alive. I am tickled to be part of the industry. It is somewhat happenstance that I came back to energy. I was busy doing green building consulting and had kind of set aside renewable energy until I got cold called by a Canadian who said, "Tim, we've reached grid parity." And that was in 2016. And then I dove in with both feet. and no regrets whatsoever. And I encourage our listeners, whether you're already an energy professional or an aspiring energy professional, to just dive in, because there is an overwhelming opportunity now in energy, whether it's in photovoltaics or wind or other emerging technologies. There's lots of runway and lots of need as a species, right? If we're going to survive the next 50 to 500 years with any grace, we really have to tackle climate chaos. So tell us more about the ideation of the book. You were probably not the first person to write a history of photovoltaics, but I think that you do have some unique approaches with your emphasis on innovation. And it is a very comprehensive history of photovoltaics. It's bittersweet to see the ebbs and flows, right? The US was a dominant player at one time in the technology and the manufacturing of photovoltaics. Then we were eclipsed by Japan, and then Germany, and then Australia, and now China. And China is really eating our global lunch. Not that we can't benefit from it still, but tell us more about the ideation of the book.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I completely agree with you about, people getting into the industry and finding a way to use their talents. I mean, that's the biggest opportunity and the biggest reason for optimism of actually dealing with these problems is actually people figuring out what they're good at, whether it's something about arts or communication or science and engineering or marketing. All of that is needed. So that's a really important message that you just made. Yeah, and in terms of the book, I kind of came at it similar to you, as I started studying solar in 2001-2 in grad school. And it was, considered an exotic technology that was interesting and had elegant physical properties, had this potential for no fuel, no pollution. That was really neat, but nothing that anyone would ever take seriously in terms of energy. Because if you worked in energy, you realized that scale was important, that reliability was important, that all of our economy is based on reliable, inexpensive energy, and solar had nothing to offer to that. And that's really been rejected because of the progress in the technology and in the markets and in how solar's emerged. And so along the way, I think I gave a presentation about 5 or 6 years ago where I had one slide on kind of where solar had come from an innovation perspective. And the thing that I was kind of just trying to map on that slide was the geographic connections of, it's starting with research with Einstein, who was from Switzerland, and then he did some work in the US, and then we had that Bell Labs that you talked about, and then it moved to Japan, and then Germany played a role, Australia played a role, and then China is the dominant producer now. And so that was partly what I wanted to map, was the time and then the geographic flows of people and knowledge and money and equipment and know-how around the world. And it really turned out to be this kind of relay race of no one country did it. Any leading country or company never had a lead for more than 2 or 3 years until some other country came along and offered something distinct. And that's, to me, as the innovation perspective, is that what I think is actually kind of amazing about how this all worked is that the US provided something quite distinct in terms of advanced technology and taking risk on early technology and finding initial niche markets. The Japanese contributed their own thing with their industrial policy and with their multinational corporations that took solar seriously. The Germans subsidized demand, and the Chinese just became incredibly creative at scaling up and making it all inexpensive and exporting it to the world. And, those are really distinct capabilities from each of those places. And we did benefit from each of them making a distinct contribution. So that's kind of where the idea for putting the whole story together. And then from there, it was really about using the data that I analyzed for quite a while, but then supplementing that with getting know-how and ideas out of people's heads. So interviewing people around the world. And that really kind of fleshed out the story. Like, for example, talking to the founder of Suntech about how he started the first production lines and how they made the next line better and different than the next, and how they scaled up and what they were responding to. So those were the types of stories I wanted to kind of combine with the data analysis I had done in the past.
It is a wonderful tale that you weave, and it's so fascinating. the United States is a bit of a conundrum to me. We are one of the most innovative countries in the world. We love to push the envelope, and yet we are also somewhat resistant to change and embracing what we, you know, I think upwards of 60% of Americans now consider climate change to be a major concern. And yet the government struggles to take substantive action uh, that is going to step us back from the brink of what is just increasingly obvious, right? When you look at the heat waves this summer in the Pacific Northwest, California and the Southwest are now in a major drought. We've had just a series of years of horrible fires out west. This year will probably be another record year, TBD, hopefully not. But the floods in Germany, and on and on and on and on, right? And so that drumbeat is just stepping up and stepping up. And I guess on some level, I'm relieved that everyday Americans are waking up, so to speak. Climate change has gone mainstream, I like to say, whereas 5 years ago, it definitely had not. And so a tipping point has been crossed culturally in some ways. And yet here we are. And, you know, the energy transition, while it is happening, the question begs, is it happening fast enough? And then you have analyses by very smart people at, you know, Rewiring America, for example, that demonstrates that, you know, we need to invest $1 trillion a year for 20 years to really see a substantive stepping back from the brink. And I'm just curious what you make of all of that, like that double edge.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And I think what you earlier mentioned is the kind of some resistance to change in the US. I think that's a good thing to pick up on, because in a lot of ways, we're especially innovative at new technologies, new ways of using technology. But in terms of making fundamental changes to our lives, our institutions, our government, you know, a lot of other countries around the world have had to do that for a variety of reasons. And in a lot of ways, we haven't. The US has had its same government, same constitution for over 200 years, and very few countries in the world can say that. And so there's, you know, benefits of stability that come from that, but there's also not a lot of experience with making fundamental changes to how our electricity system works, or how it's regulated, or how government intervenes with the innovation system or with the environment. And so other countries have a bit more recent experience with that. So that may be something we need to make a change ourselves in terms of approaching it. And then in terms of actually being more optimistic we can do this, I think, yeah, there's two kind of fodders for thinking about change. And one of them is just the problem getting worse and being more apparent and being visceral, and people smelling the smoke from wildfires, or having to move, or at least relocate or pack a bag. That's affecting a lot of people in a kind of an ongoing way. So yeah, that's true. That wasn't around 5 years ago or even a few years ago. So that's changing minds. The second is there is this kind of positive feedback cycle where you have a policy, and, you know, you could go back to the R&D programs in the 1970s under Nixon and Project Independence that really helped catalyze and create the solar that we have today. So, and that's happened in other countries too. So you've got a bunch of policies that are stimulating the technology. The technology is getting better. It's getting more efficient. It's getting cheaper to produce. It's getting easier to use. So you've got policy improving, technology improving as a result. And then you've got politics that starts to change, because you've got entities, maybe it's utilities, maybe it's startups, maybe it's consumers, that see benefits to inexpensive, reliable solar, especially in combination with digitalization on the grid and batteries and wind power that complements it. And so then you start to have this coalition, a political coalition that's supportive of this transition. And that, you know, wasn't the case before. Like solar was on the edges and other renewables were as well. And it was trying to get a seat at the table, but didn't have one. And now that, as you say, we have hundreds of thousands of jobs in the US in renewables and solar, and we've got political power, then you can start to see, well, maybe there is this positive feedback where as the technology grows, there's more support for it. And the potential of having broader change in the economy and policy to deal with climate change starts to look a lot more realistic, even if all you care about are, what happens to important political actors. Like that's what political scientists look at. And they've always been dismissive of climate change because there just wasn't enough support. But now you've got this broad public support because of, as you say, the impacts that are being witnessed. But you've also got, lobbyists and interest groups that also have a real stake in dealing with climate change. And so that also makes me optimistic that some of the change that seems like it's been so elusive is starting to actually pick a momentum and could happen here.
I keep, just pinching myself and saying, there is hope, we can do this. And, but it's like, I'm constantly buffered by the noise that's going on around us, and the pandemic isn't helping, of course. That is a major economic and social challenge that really just creates friction, as I see it, and prevents us perhaps of breaking through and having more clarity on the long game and the real problems that we're trying to address. I'm also curious what you make of charismatic entrepreneurs like Elon Musk, who is my favorite at the moment, because he really has taken a stand for sustainability. And he is single-mindedly trying to go to Mars as a backup plan for humanity. He recognizes that a catastrophic event is not only likely, it is guaranteed. And if we don't have a backup, then our odds of surviving that are very, very small. And so what is the role of charismatic entrepreneurs in leading the charge and catalyzing change?
Yeah, I mean, from an innovation systems perspective, which is where I come from, one of the fundamental ideas there is that, adoption of new technologies happens quite slowly. And it happens quite slowly because there's a lot of risk aversion, especially early on. So people see a new technology as, different, that it might, challenge their existing business, that it might not work that well, that it might, might be too expensive. And so there's a bunch of reasons why people take a while to start saying, okay, I'm going to buy a mobile phone, or I'm going to get an internet connection to my house. It doesn't happen immediately as they're available. And so on the other side of that are sometimes it's just more general hype, but you do kind of have to break through that resistance with something that gets people's attention. And Elon Musk, and before that, Steve Jobs and others have done that, and it plays an important role. And, the other thing that people see from an innovation perspective is people tend to over expect from technologies in the near term and under expect in the long term. And so people are often disappointed in the short term because we don't all have electric cars right away. But in the long term, as you get to this kind of S-shaped adoption curve, it takes off at some point. It's whether it's costs, it's availability of charging, it's just reliability, or people that have had experience with it or talk to neighbors. And all of a sudden that stuff just takes off. And so the hard part is really early on, where you have to build the first, 500,000 car a year factory or a model that's under $50,000 or whatever it is. And so, yeah, having someone like Elon Musk that catalyzes investment, gets people excited about the technology, and helps produce something that is, fun and exciting and not just kind of a sacrifice or a way to display your green credentials. That's played a huge role. And that's taking on the global car industry and to some extent the oil industry producing gasoline for traditional cars. So I think it plays an incredibly large role. Solar really hasn't had anyone like that, not to the same extent where they're really the face of the industry. There's been really important people along the way, like Martin Green in Australia, someone I feature in the book, who played a really important role, and Paul Maycock, who ran the Department of Energy program in the 1970s, and others as well. But that's a case where it's one person has just made such a difference. So yeah, I think when you've got new technologies, you need rapid adoption, something that can kind of accelerate adoption, like for example, like you say, a charismatic individual that plays an important role.
I like to say that capitalism can be a force for good, but I also recognize that capitalism has a dark side. And there are forces, the fossil fuel industry being one, and how they have leveraged money in politics to control the system to their favor, and tried to, in many ways, and this continues to this day, hold back the energy transition for their own benefit. And it is, again, it is one of these double-edged phenomena that I don't want to live in a non-democratic, non-capitalist society. I've traveled all over the world and I choose to live in the United States. I do think that we are one of the greatest nations on earth, but I think that we still have a lot to learn about how to manage that power, because the power of capitalism is so vast. Sometimes we are ignorant that it also has to be managed, and there is a role for good government, and it's nice to now sigh a sigh of relief that we have a government in place in Washington that gets it and is really putting credible people in positions of power, like our friend Jigar Shah, who now heads up the DOE loan program and is really going to be a force for good and helping to fuel these next waves of innovation that we so dearly need. Do you have thoughts about capitalism in general?
I mean, so well, first of all, what you said, the hiring from the Biden administration has just been A plus plus. It's been amazing. The people that they've gotten to work to take these really challenging jobs that are going to be a lot of them away from their families and just working 7 days a week. And so it's really amazing the talent that's there now. And two, what they're doing in terms of the array of policies. So it's not all just hung on one legislation that they're trying to pass. It's a full-on approach that includes what the government's doing in its own operations, trying to pass some legislation in Congress, executive orders, international engagement, all of it. And I think that full front of efforts is really what's going to make it successful. So yeah, I'm encouraged as well on that. And in terms of, capitalism, like the idea of being able to invest in early stage technologies that are risky, that you would take a portfolio approach, that some of them might work, but most won't, that there's benefits to scale, that the ones that like take off will actually do really well and disproportionate. I mean, that's kind of what we want to harness. And we want to have learning curves and economies of scale and scale up, because all this needs to happen quickly. So there's really an important role for capitalism that, there's other models out there, but they may not be ones that the US would be really adept at. China's got its own model that seems to be working pretty well. I think that the part where it becomes more contentious is how capitalism intersects with governance, with how governments operate and how decisions are made. And so, there, to some extent, there should be a way that you can have good decisions made for the benefit of everyone that are, kind of done with governments, and that you have companies that are working on doing benefits for their customers and their employees and for their investors. And so, there's a way that they should be able to work together. But it's hard when the returns to being large seem to be so large. And I think that's something that information technology and connectedness has really accelerated, so that you have just a few big winners and lots of small companies that are hard to compete. And that, that makes it hard for those large winners to not want to have political power in addition to profits and economic power. So that is a challenge, is how do you manage really large companies in terms of to what extent they should affect governance? And so, yeah, that's an ongoing challenge that we're likely to have.
We see this in the fear, uncertainty, and doubt that is created around the EV revolution, right? There's so much resistance in the mainstream media, in Wall Street to Tesla, particularly. Tesla owns 70% of the EV market in the United States. And they're the first successful new car company in the US in over 100 years. I think they're a wonderful darling. We should be doing everything we can to help Elon Musk be successful. And yet, there are many forces that are continuing to try to push back on him. I don't think they will succeed, and the short sellers are a good example of basically people that are wrong. But well, let's talk about your work with the IPCC a little bit and the big picture and how humanity can leverage our experience with the PV industry. I was just thrilled to see that you dug into direct air capture because it's in the news a fair amount now. And you wrote your book in 2019, meaning you did research in the 2015 to 2018, that was years in the making, I'm sure. And yet you have a whole chapter almost, I think, dedicated to this emerging technology, which is going to be important. Let's face it, right? Many of my friends in the environmental movement want to say, Tim, we can just take, farm soil and plant trees and do all this natural stuff. I'm a forest ecology from UW-Madison. I love trees and I love the ecosystem services that nature can provide, and they are relevant and important. But to get back to 350, okay, we are going to need carbon engineering and companies like that are going to suck carbon explicitly out of the atmosphere and turn it into useful products for the economy. I know I've given you a lot to chew on there, but what's going on first and foremost with the IPCC, and how does that relate to the economy?
So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, this is the United Nations panel on providing scientific information on climate change for the international negotiations on climate change. And so I'm a lead author on that. And, one thing in the report that we are working on, will be released next March, it looks like. So that's a report on how do we address climate change? What are the solutions? And one of the things I've been completely encouraged by is that people in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change are picking up on the solar story, that it takes a while for people to appreciate something that's developing so quickly. And yet throughout that report, there's a lot of appreciation that, okay, this is a real technology. It's a real part of the solutions. The improvements in cost and the rapid adoption have been amazing. And I think in the past, there's often been a concern like, okay, yeah, it's growing quickly, but it's from such a tiny base, it doesn't matter. And that's true. But when you grow at 30% for 30 years, you start to get to something serious. So now 2019 is the last data I have, with 3% of electricity supply from solar for the whole world. So that includes a lot of countries that are doing almost nothing on solar. And if that continues to grow at 30 or 40% a year, we're talking about getting another percentage point every year or two. And so things will really change. And so it's not an issue of it not growing fast enough. It's just an issue of solar continuing to grow. And so when people start to see that, then they start to say, okay, this is actually something that can play a large part of the solution, not all of it, but a really important role. And that we'll start to see that translate into reducing emissions as well. So that's been really encouraging to see, the UN appreciating the role of solar and seeing it as a potentially central aspect of dealing with climate change. And then on direct air capture, that's been an interesting technology. I did my first paper on doing a learning curve for direct air capture in 2009, 2010. And at the time, solar wasn't really inexpensive and it really looked like direct air capture, we might need to lean really heavily on it. It was also a time of very high oil prices. And so one thing we were looking at was, well, would Middle Eastern oil and gas producers actually be the ones that would want to fund development of direct air capture so that they could preserve the value of their oil and gas reserves? And they didn't take us up because, and an answer to us was like, yeah, they probably should. They do better if they did that. They didn't take us up on that, at least from what I can tell. But other companies have made some substantial progress. As you mentioned, there's 2 countries that have commercial plants around the world on removing CO2 from the atmosphere with chemical reactions and then storing it permanently underground. And there's an array of companies that are developing, alternative technologies and other ways to do it as well. So I think that's really encouraging. One thing that I get from my work at the UN, the IPCC, is working with the modelers who look at, how do we actually get an energy system or a world economy that is aligned with, say, 2 degrees. And it really is hard to do that without some removal of CO2. And so that keeps me motivated. We need, something on the order of 10 or 20% of what we put into the air today going the other direction by 2050. And from the innovation perspective, we know that stuff takes time to scale up, especially to that scale, which is gigatons a year. So we need to be really getting on that. And one thing we've been saying is that 2 companies with commercial plants today, it doesn't cut it. Because if you look at the solar example, we had a commercial plant in 1958, one of the first satellites in response to Sputnik. And then we've got cheap solar in 2016, 2017. So 60 years, that's too long. If we've got our first direct air capture in 2017, that puts us at cheap direct air capture in 2070s. That's way too late. So the key there is, how do we accelerate? How do we design policies and industrial facilities that make this all happen on the order of a factor of 4 faster? And, we can take some ideas from other places, things that have worked, and do them more of them to make them faster. Vaccines with mRNA last year, that was exactly the difference. That was a factor of 4 faster than, I think it was the measles vaccine was the fastest ever. And so we did it 4 times faster than that. So there's precedent when there's a lot of attention, there's policy, there's funding on the science side as well as on the market side. And that's what we did with vaccines. So, completely different technologies than what we'd need with direct air capture, but something to learn from in terms of where we want to put our emphasis policy-wise to make it all happen faster, because that's really the key, the speed.
I love that assessment that we need to do this 4x faster. That's great to know. But man, that's intimidating, because like I said in the opening, everybody needs electricity, or they certainly want it if they know it exists. And sucking carbon out of the atmosphere is a whole other ball of wax. Yes, you can make useful products from it. You can make building materials. You can make fuels to fuel transportation, for example. But, and we all need those things, but there's also a plethora of really easy, cheap, already established technologies in those spaces. So just diving a little deeper under the skin of direct air capture, what is going to cause an inflection point, in your opinion, that is going to get us, to that 4x?
Yeah, that's a good question. So a few of the things that look promising to me is there are these policy independent niche markets. So places where consumers are willing to pay a high price for whatever reason. And it's not a gigantic market, but it's enough to get started. So, beverages on islands, the cost of CO2 for bottling there is really expensive. And so you could actually do that with direct air capture and compete. It's already being developed for enhanced oil recovery. So to get more oil out of it, existing oil fields. So if we're talking about a net zero economy, that doesn't seem like exactly where we want to go by producing more oil. But in terms of scaling up the industry and getting it taken seriously and getting a few plants built, that's providing a pretty important signal there. So niche markets as a way to build up to the larger markets, and the larger markets will require policy ultimately, someone to create incentives to say, okay, if you build a plant, remove CO2 from the atmosphere and store it underground permanently, you can be rewarded for that. You're going to get $100 a ton or $150 a ton or something like that. And there's a few policies that exist today that do that. There's a tax credit in the US that gives you $50 a ton. And there's an emissions trading system in California that gives about $200 a ton. And so some of these early plants are actually being built in response to those because they're in the money or close to it if they can get that $250 per ton of CO2. So it's kind of the sequence of some niche markets with high willingness to pay that are small. Then you get to maybe bigger ones with lower willingness to pay. Then you get to a policy market where it's maybe $100 a ton. And all the time in each market, you're iterating, improving scale, and getting the cost down. And so that's got to be the playbook for direct air capture, is getting the cost down to something that is, affordable. And there are places around the world that are paying $100 per ton for to emit CO2, and so that then it would make economic sense even today. So I think that's the playbook, but it all has to happen quite fast, and that is the challenge: is how to scale up in the next 20 years to something really big, kind of on the scale of the oil and gas industry today.
Mm-hmm. Are there other technologies that you have your eye on that you think could play a major role in reducing our carbon footprint?
Yeah. So, the carbon removal work includes direct air capture, but then some of these others as well. I think, when you've got some general purpose technology that's playing a role, and I think in the case of other carbon removal technologies, you've got digitalization happening, so more information moving around the system, that can be helpful. But then also progress in synthetic biology that's only barely been tapped on in the energy system, but potentially you could, see something with that, like, roots that specifically sequester carbon and agriculture based on that. And so I have some optimism of things developing there, because there's basic science happening in a really fast way in those areas. So that's something that I think is important to think about. The digitalization on the energy side, so information technology moving around, that starts to really help us get from being concerned about having 5% renewables on the grid and then being like, okay, that's okay, but 30% is too hard, or 50% is too hard, and then you start to see places that are 80 or 100% renewables. Being able to manage those power flows and predict those and coordinate with other sources like wind and solar, and then store some of that with batteries or other storage, that seems like that can do a lot of the heavy lifting there. And then you've got some outlier technologies like advanced nuclear technologies, especially some of the smaller scale ones that could potentially play a role. And there's science improving there. And, so far those have turned out to be taking a long time to build, really expensive. But, we'll see. There's potential for getting some of this idea of modularity and serial and mass production into nuclear. And I talked a little bit about that in my book, but, we'll have to see on that. It could be that there's certain places where that gets tested, and we'll see if it really works, if the costs can come down, if they're considered safe and reliable. So that, there's some of those that I just keep an eye on, and that we might want to, make some bets to preserve them as options, even if it's not clear right now that they play a kind of a central role. But solar does look like it will play a central, one of the key, founding pillars: solar, batteries, wind, digitalization throughout the energy system. Those seem like really the pillars.
Yeah, I have zero doubt that we can now completely clean the grid and get to a net zero grid using solar, wind, and batteries, just those three technologies. There will be others, of course. They will be closed loop pumped hydro. Huge potential there. You need mountains. And so that works where you have the right geography. And modular nuclear, big fan. We're doing it on submarines all the time, right? Those modular reactors are out there, and nuclear submarines can stay underwater for over a year. It is a very robust technology, and we will need that for going to space, and we do need to go to space as a backup. So in a way, I'm in the Jiggershaw camp who says just deploy, right? We already have most of the technology that we need in order to make the energy transition. Now, to decarbonize society, we probably need more technologies. I'm just talking about the grid. And the grid is responsible for something like 70% of emissions. So that's a big one. Transportation, we're solving that now with electric vehicles, and now electric aircraft are coming on the scene. We're going to see a regional electric aircraft market here in the US and globally in the next 5 years, it looks like. So that's very promising. I'm a huge fan of new, better technology, but I also am of the opinion that we need to come together as a species. We're still very focused on my. Let's make America better. Let's protect America. Let's fight the Chinese. And I don't want to ignore the fact that the Chinese are doing some things that are very dangerous and anti-human rights. Okay, I'm a big fan of the U.S. government standing up against the human rights violations in Xinjiang province with the Uyghurs. That's a good thing. But in the greater scheme of things, Professor Nemet, what do you think about this? It's almost like tribalism is a technology or a raison d'etre that has outlived its usefulness in so many ways. Do you think about this?
Yeah, I mean, it was a big part of the solar book, is it was so obvious that it was people and companies that were transcending national boundaries that were making the progress. And that's what made everything go so much faster than it otherwise would have. And when, you referenced earlier, we're not going to have our eye on climate change as the most important issue for the next 50 years, even if it needs to be very high on the agenda. Other things will come up. There'll be possibly pandemics or financial crisis or security issues. And so, when something happens in one country that you lose interest in climate or energy or this transition, it's helpful to have other countries moving things along as well. So there really is a robustness to the whole system by having multiple countries kind of collaborating and exchanging. And that was super clear in the book. And so one of the things I've come across in the last couple of years as I've kind of brought these ideas, especially into the policy and political realm, is this idea of kind of wanting to do everything ourselves. And I sometimes would call it innovation nationalism. Is we want all the jobs here, we want the manufacturing here, we want to reshore things, and we don't really want to have trade. We don't want to be sending US dollars abroad. And I think that is kind of, that's like a idea from maybe 100 years ago that is just doesn't fit with the supply chains and with how innovation works today. And so I think if we really do make efforts to wall ourselves off and have this kind of nationalistic approach on innovation and on climate, it might work, but it'll definitely slow things down. And that's the opposite direction we need to be going. We need to be speeding things up. And so, yeah, things come up like Uyghurs and how China has treated them in Xinjiang, and how mining for cobalt happens in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and other issues along the way. And so we need to address those. But we really shouldn't see those problems as reasons to disengage from the rest of the world and take our eyes off the ball in this transition. We need to, deal with those and improve them. And whether it's recycling or dealing with human rights or finding other ways to other materials to source, there's lots of different possibilities there. But if I don't like if the idea is to kind of isolate ourselves, because I think that's just it slows things down too much and makes them less likely to be successful.
Putting your book's website on screen, howsolargotcheap.com. And you see right there the flags of the US, Japan, Germany, Australia, and China. And that is one of the beautiful things, as you pointed out, of the solar industry. It is extremely international, and I love that. I love international cooperation and collaboration, and I see that as one of the strengths of the International Space Station, right? That is a place where we are collaborating day in and day out with the Japanese and the Europeans and even the Russians, which you just don't see in the everyday world. And so I do think that space is an important place for humanity. It takes a tremendous amount of resources. We're very wealthy as in the West, right? In the developed world, we have loads and loads and loads of resources, but it's going to take pooling those resources to solve major problems like space travel, like climate change, like global pandemics. And so I really encourage our listeners to check out your website here, where you have these frameworks like technology push, knowledge flows, demand pull. It's a very concise and understandable model for how humanity has come together to create this technology that, by some estimates, solar PV is going to be 70% of the grid in 2050. It is going to be a major, major part of the future grid. While we're still in the 5% zone, right? We're just down here on that S curve. We're getting ready to go vertical, and it is going to be a rocket ship. So hold on tight. In our last few minutes together, Professor Nemet, what do you say to young people who are casting about for their next move, or career changers for that matter? How can people, get traction, so to speak?
Yeah, I mean, that's something I deal with quite often as an instructor in a college, and seeing, undergraduates and graduate students. And yeah, the one thing that I would say is that the flip side of this being such a tremendous challenge is it creates such a tremendous opportunity. Like, as you say, if we go from 5% of electricity today to 70% over the next few decades, and those next few decades are the core of someone who's graduating in the next few years, what an amazing opportunity to put your skills to work, figure out what you're good at, what you enjoy doing, whether it's marketing, whether it's something like installing solar and electric vehicle chargers, or repairing or maintaining those, or something that's more, on communications and how that works, whether it's climate change or the energy system. There's so many different aspects to this transition. And when I talk to people that work in engineering firms and project development firms, their biggest concern is not the cost of these technologies or the stability of the grid. That's really, they've got that figured out. Their biggest concern is finding the people, finding the talent to make this transition happen. And they're looking to hire people really quickly. So I think, getting some broad understanding of the climate problem and the energy system by listening to this podcast and maybe taking some courses on that, that's really helpful. And then figuring out what you're good at and what you like to do, and finding a role, because there will be roles, because the growth here is just tremendous, and it really has its momentum now. And so I think, it's a great time to be looking for finding a way to get involved and making a positive impact on this issue.
It's really through action that we are creating the future and maintaining some level of optimism. There are many challenges that we face, but as you said, the opportunities are vast. And so if you just put one foot in front of the other, if you network, if you reach out, if you absorb knowledge, as Elon Musk likes to say, you can get a PhD on YouTube today. And of course, I'm a big fan of higher education as well. It's a both and world. You can get your letters and get your degrees from accredited universities, and that's a good thing. But you can also just read books and watch videos and listen to podcasts and absorb a tremendous amount of knowledge that folks like yourself have accumulated over decades. So thank you for doing that. I really appreciate the work that you do. How can our listeners reach you, Professor Nemet?
Well, that website you mentioned, howsolargotcheap.com, I really tried to put everything together there, and includes my contact information as well. So I really encourage people to take a look. That's the summary of the book in just a few web pages, and has contact information there as well. And I'm really always excited to hear from people and reach out to them as well.
Great. Well, thank you. Check out How Solar Got Cheap. You can reach me, Tim Montague, host here of the Solar Podcast, at cesnrg.com, where we post all of these interviews. We interview manufacturers like Lumos Solar, the primo architectural solar technology in the world. Thought leaders like Mark Pruitt, who is the original director of the Illinois Power Agency, and innovators like Shala, the solar artist, who's creating beautiful sculptures out of solar PV technology, and emerging technologies, so to speak, like the American Solar Grazing Association, creating multiple uses out of solar photovoltaic fields. So check it out at cesnrg.com. I also do a news roundup show with my co-host, John Weaver, called the Clean Power Hour. Please subscribe to the channel, share it with your friends, and make comments. We'd love to hear from our listeners. With that, I want to say thank you to our guest, Professor Nemet from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, the author of How Solar Became Cheap. Thank you so much, Professor Nemet.
Thank you. Really enjoyed talking to you.